Hey guys, today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. San Clemente, located on the Southern California coastline, has long been associated with the ideal of suburban life. Quiet streets lined with swaying palm trees, elegant homes, and an atmosphere of tranquility. The town appeals to those who prize peace, favorable weather, and a safe environment in which to raise children. Life here is far removed from the hustle of major cities. Time seems to move slower, and the low crime rate reinforces San Clemente's image as a miniature American dream. So when the events of November 2016 unfolded, they struck the community as nothing less than a shock. The public, accustomed to San Clemente's spotless reputation as a safe suburb, was stunned by what took place in the home of a well-known couple. Suzanne Sills was born in Philadelphia and, from a young age, drew notice for her vivacious spirit and open nature. Classmates remembered her as someone whose presence couldn't be overlooked, always ready with support, a witty joke, or a new idea, and in that way she became well known to many. After finishing high school in 1989, she enrolled at George Mason University. Suzanne's ambitions went beyond earning a degree. She set long-term goals for herself and planned a career that exceeded typical expectations. In 2000, she earned an MBA in International Studies from the University of Miami, cementing her reputation as someone motivated by success and ready for serious challenges. Her peers often remarked on her natural charm and exceptional conversational skills. Sharp of mind, with a sardonic yet always polite sense of humor, she left a lasting impression on those who had the chance to interact with her. Beneath her seemingly carefree exterior, however, was a deeply felt personal struggle, a passionate desire to become a mother. Repeated and unsuccessful attempts to conceive caused her pain she shared only with her closest confidants. In public, she appeared joyful, but internally she waged an exhausting battle, one that left deep scars on her life and would later influence her decisions. Scott Sills stood out among his peers even during his school years. Classmates recalled times when he showed up to class not in the usual jeans and t-shirt, but instead in a full three-piece suit. That wasn't seen as eccentric. It was viewed as a reflection of his drive for individuality. Even back then, he had the reputation of being exceptionally intelligent. Teachers and classmates often spoke of his photographic memory, analytical mind, and uncanny ability to solve complex problems on the fly. For many who knew him in his youth, he was the first real example of a genius. Someone who impressed not just with sharp wit, but with deep, thoughtful insight. After high school, the future looked bright for Scott Sills. Those around him believed he would thrive in any field he chose. But Scott didn't go for money or status. He chose medicine. It wasn't just the science that drew him in, but the chance to make a real difference, to impact lives in a meaningful way. He found his calling in reproductive medicine, a field that demands not only advanced medical knowledge but also deep empathy, as patients often face profound emotional challenges. It wasn't long before he became known as a respected infertility specialist. Colleagues noted that he wasn't one to settle for standard procedures. He constantly pushed boundaries, introducing innovative methods and embracing emerging technologies. Scott's career rose fast. He took the traits that had once made him stand out in school, confidence, precision, a unique way of thinking, and turned them into professional strengths. Over time, the image of a bright, driven student transformed into that of a doctor, patients trusted with some of their most sensitive struggles. His personal life, his family, and eventually his business would all grow on the foundation he'd built during those formative years. It was through his work that he met Suzanne. At the time, Suzanne was in her first marriage and battling infertility. She turned to Scott, then a rising figure in reproductive health, hoping he could help her achieve the one thing she wanted more than anything: to become a mother. Their early interactions were strictly professional. He led her treatment. She saw him as a bridge to the future she'd always dreamed of. But despite all efforts, her marriage couldn't withstand the emotional weight of repeated failures. It ended in divorce. Not long after, Scott's own marriage also came to an end. In that time of personal upheaval, the once clinical relationship between them began to shift. They found solace in each other, a shared understanding forged by disappointment and the emotional toll of what they'd both endured. Eventually, Suzanne and Scott married. Not long after, they welcomed twins, a boy, Eric, and a girl, Marie Catherine, conceived through in vitro fertilization. It was a moment of triumph. For Suzanne, finally becoming a mother; for Scott, seeing his work lead to such a deeply personal success. Together, they formed a large, blended family. Scott already had children from a previous marriage, and now Suzanne took on the role of stepmother in addition to caring for their newborns. The household brought together kids of different ages and backgrounds under one roof, and from the outside, it looked like they were making it work. The family appeared to be thriving, a picture of suburban harmony built on second chances and hard-earned joy. Their life together looked like the perfect balance between personal fulfillment and professional success. What began with a shared interest in medicine grew into a deep connection, driven by common goals and completed by the arrival of children. From the outside, it all seemed like a natural next step for two people who had each been through divorce and managed to build something stronger, a new family grounded in ambition, mutual support, and the long-awaited joy of parenthood. In 2015, Suzanne and Scott decided to launch their own fertility clinic. While they shared the same vision, their roles were clearly defined. Scott, with his medical license and clinical background, became the face of the practice. The lead physician, the expert patients came to see, but the actual business, the entire operational backbone, rested almost entirely on Suzanne's shoulders. She handled everything behind the scenes, developing the clinic's concept, creating the brand identity, crafting marketing strategies, recruiting staff, securing equipment, setting up the space, managing client records, regulatory paperwork, and forging business partnerships. Without her energy and drive, the clinic wouldn't have grown nearly as fast. Meanwhile, Scott's professional credibility landed him television appearances, including spots on CBS's The Doctors, where he discussed infertility and advanced treatments. These public appearances boosted the clinic's visibility and brought in new patients. But inside the business, it was Suzanne's tireless efforts that kept the wheels turning. The clinic flourished. Patients frequently commented on the personalized care and the warm, calming atmosphere, a direct result of Suzanne's attention to detail. As their popularity surged, so did demand, and the clinic became not only successful, but financially stable. The public image of Scott as the charismatic medical expert, combined with Suzanne's behind-the-scenes leadership, made them seem like a power couple, respected and admired. But beneath that polished surface, tensions were building. The pressure of running the business day to day weighed heavily on Suzanne. Scott was often away, focused on clinical duties and media appearances, while the endless administrative work fell squarely on her. Over time, a quiet disconnect grew. Their differing views on each other's contributions became a source of silent strain. Outwardly, they still appeared to be the perfect couple, but Suzanne was burning out. The gap between their public persona and the actual division of responsibilities at home and at work became harder to ignore. One place where Suzanne allowed herself more honesty was on an online forum called patrick.net. Posting under the username Tortorelle, She became known for her bold tone and sharp wit, even in a space dominated by a male audience and often intense debates. In one thread, she made a tongue-in-cheek promise. If Donald Trump were nominated for president, she'd post a revealing photo. When that moment came, she kept her word. To Suzanne, it was a playful bet, a way to show that she stood by what she said. But in the context of her marriage, it may have landed differently. Scott, who carefully cultivated his image as a reputable doctor and clinic director, suddenly found himself grappling with a moment of public exposure that clashed with the perfect couple narrative they'd presented to patients and colleagues alike. Later, in the home office, a printed copy of that forum thread was found, a sign that Scott had taken notice. He hadn't overlooked it. In fact, it appeared he'd studied it closely. That's how the gap began to grow, between the image they projected and the private reality inside their home. To the outside world, they looked like a model couple, successful co-owners of a thriving fertility clinic, proud parents of 4 children, living the dream in a quiet, Southern California suburb. But behind closed doors, their relationship was increasingly strained by clashing expectations, unresolved tensions over roles, and a shared need to stay in control. On the evening of November 12th, 2016, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were no visitors, no last-minute errands, just another quiet night at home. Suzanne had been suffering from a severe migraine. The intense sensitivity to light and noise forced her to shut down her devices and retreat into darkness. After briefly resting downstairs, she decided to move from the master bedroom to her daughter's room, where it was quieter. Before heading upstairs, she followed her usual routine, locking the family dogs in their crates to prevent them from roaming at night. By then, Marie-Catherine was already asleep. Their son, Eric, came downstairs to check on his mother. The exchange was short, just a few words. He wanted to make sure her migraine hadn't gotten worse. Satisfied, he returned upstairs. The house fell into a temporary calm. Around 3:40 a.m., Eric woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. It wasn't shouting, but something about the way his parents were talking struck him as different. He clearly heard them discussing work and email replies. Suzanne was insisting on finishing some messages, worried that delays might disrupt the clinic's operations. Scott, on the other hand, was urging her to stop, arguing that she shouldn't be working in her condition and asking her to shut the laptop. According to Eric, the disagreement didn't last more than 5 minutes. Not wanting to get involved, Eric quietly went into the master bedroom and lay down next to his sister. He told her their parents were talking downstairs about work stuff and suggested they just wait until morning before going down. After that, he didn't hear any more footsteps on the stairs. He didn't see his father come back upstairs. The house settled into silence. To avoid waking Marie-Catherine, the hallway light was left dim. Her door was slightly open, the bed already made, ready for Suzanne to lie down and rest in peace and quiet. The decision to sleep there instead of in the master bedroom was a reflection of her migraine. Even the smallest sound had become painful. There were no unexpected calls, no alarms, no knocks at the door that night. The whole family was home. The doors were locked. Their Sunday schedule was supposed to follow the usual routine. Morning came on November 13th, 2016, and everything at first seemed perfectly normal. The kids woke up in the master bedroom with their dad. Scott was cheerful, full of energy, and immediately started talking about plans. A trip to the pool, then breakfast together as a family. His voice was calm, familiar. Just another peaceful weekend morning, or so it seemed. Marie-Catherine was the first to wake up that morning. When she opened her bedroom door and looked over the railing, her eyes locked onto something that would change her life forever. Her mother's motionless body at the bottom of the staircase. Suzanne was lying on her back. Wrapped tightly around her neck was a red and white scarf. In a panic, Marie-Catherine rushed down and tried to help. She tore off the scarf, desperately shaking her mother, begging her to wake up. But there was no response. Eric came downstairs shortly after. He froze halfway down the stairs, taking in the scene below. His sister was already by their mother's side, trying to revive her, but nothing was working. Eric later recalled that there were no signs of a fall, no broken objects, no signs of struggle. It was eerily quiet, too quiet for an accident. Scott followed them down next. His reaction was brief and controlled. He told the kids to back away, not to touch anything, and to keep their distance. Then he made the call to emergency services. The recording of that call would later become a key piece of evidence. On the call, Scott was calm, almost too calm. He gave the address, stated that his wife was unresponsive, not breathing, with no pulse. He confirmed that only the family was present in the home. The dispatcher immediately began guiding him through first response steps, checking for breath, attempted attempting compressions, monitoring until help arrived. Scott responded quickly, clearly, acknowledging each instruction. There was no panic in his voice. He sounded steady, measured, clinical. That tone, detached, almost procedural, would later raise questions among investigators. Marie-Catherine stood nearby, scarf in hand, stunned and confused. Following her father's direction, she placed the scarf on a nearby table. Eric lingered on the stairs, eyes fixed on the front door, waiting for help to arrive. The house was silent except for Scott's brief exchanges with the dispatcher. The minutes dragged on. For the children, the situation was too surreal to fully grasp. They clung to their father's composed tone, trusting that everything would be okay. But it wasn't. Scott confirmed. No breathing, no pulse. He followed instructions to the letter, but there was no sign of life. When law enforcement arrived at the Sills residence, Scott greeted them immediately and provided his account of what had happened. According to him, Suzanne had been suffering from a severe migraine, and during the night, she must have fallen down the stairs. He claimed he found her unconscious at the bottom of the staircase. His story was straightforward, confident, no hesitation. But something about Scott's demeanor struck officers as unusual. He allowed a full walkthrough of the house without resistance, even encouraged a search. He insisted there was nothing to hide. His willingness to cooperate felt a little too eager, almost rehearsed. As officers began documenting the scene, something odd caught their attention right away. A stainless steel pot lying at the foot of the stairs. Its placement didn't make sense. The kitchen was a good distance away, and the rest of the house was orderly. There was no logical reason for a cooking pot to be there. When questioned, Scott couldn't explain why it was there either. The second detail that immediately raised red flags for investigators was the scarf. Although Marie-Catherine had removed it from her mother's neck, the knot was far too tight and carefully made to have formed on its own during a fall. Experts on the scene noted that the way it had been wrapped didn't match the pattern of an accidental injury. Another piece of the puzzle came from medication. On Suzanne's nightstand were empty boxes of migraine tablets, but the number of blister packs didn't line up with how long she had supposedly been taking them. Even stranger, the packaging had been arranged almost too neatly, as if placed there intentionally to be noticed. Police also noted other oddities: the immaculate condition of the house, the absence of any signs of struggle, and the unusual stillness of the scene. These factors didn't fit with the narrative of a sudden, accidental death. Instead, they gave the impression of a setting deliberately staged to look like an accident. Despite these suspicions, no official conclusions were drawn at first. On the surface, the tragedy could still be taken for a fall. But the details, the pot at the base of the stairs, the scarf, the medication, suggested something else. This first impression stuck with investigators and became the foundation for a deeper probe into Suzanne's death. The initial investigation inside the Sills home quickly started turning up critical evidence. A closer forensic sweep revealed findings that dramatically shifted the picture. While the area near the staircase seemed to support Scott's version of events, evidence discovered in other parts of the house undermined it. In the daughter's room, investigators found bloodstains, not just one or two spots, but on multiple surfaces: curtains, walls, and furniture. This pointed to something happening there that involved head or facial injury. DNA analysis matched the blood to Suzanne. Investigators also recovered strands of her hair, not just lying on the floor, but partially caught in the curtain fabric, ruling out an accidental transfer. Together, these findings suggested that Suzanne had been in that room when she sustained trauma. Scott told investigators he hadn't noticed any blood in the house and that he found his wife at the bottom of the stairs before immediately calling emergency services. But that statement conflicted with the visible evidence. The bloodstains in the room were impossible to miss, and his claim of not seeing them rang hollow. Compounding the doubt, a physical examination of Scott revealed minor injuries, a cut on his head and a bruise on his arm. He explained them away as small mishaps from working on the car with his son the day before. This stage of the investigation marked a turning point. For the first time, it became undeniably clear that Scott's account didn't match the physical evidence. Investigators concluded that the tragedy could not have unfolded the way he claimed. The blood evidence in the daughter's room and inconsistencies in his statements pointed to another version of events, one that had been carefully concealed and would now need to be meticulously reconstructed. The investigation's key moment came with the forensic autopsy, an in-depth medical examination to determine whether Suzanne's death had been accidental or the result of foul play. In the morgue, pathologists began a detailed analysis of her body. The first significant finding was a fracture in the third cervical vertebra, C3. This type of injury indicates forceful trauma to the neck and is commonly associated with strangulation, not with falling onto a hard surface. It was the first major piece of evidence that directly contradicted the story of a simple household accident. Further examination revealed clear signs of asphyxiation. Marks on her neck precisely matched the shape and positioning of the scarf found at the scene. The pressure lines were distinct and directional, far too defined to be accidental. The tight knot and the angle of the marks suggested that the fabric had been deliberately used to cut off her air supply. A particularly telling detail was the presence of petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes, tiny blood spots caused by lack of oxygen, a strong clinical indicator of suffocation. No fall could account for all these combined symptoms. Medical experts concluded definitively, Suzanne's death was not accidental. It was the result of physical violence. All the earlier red flags noticed by police were now validated by forensic evidence. The scarf that Marie Catherine had removed from her mother's neck was, in fact, the weapon used in her death. In 2017, following a full review of the medical findings and completion of official reports, Suzanne Sills' death was legally classified as a homicide. That decision moved the case into a new phase. Law enforcement was no longer dealing with a tragic fall. They were building a murder case. The investigation officially shifted away from any theory of misadventure and focused entirely on uncovering the facts behind what now appeared to be a calculated act of violence. And in that story, Scott Sills remained the primary suspect. Once Suzanne's death was ruled a homicide, the public and the authorities expected Scott to withdraw, to mourn, to process the loss quietly. But what happened next shocked many. Rather than showing the sorrow of a grieving husband, Scott seemed to reinvent himself almost overnight. Soon after the incident, he re-emerged, different. On social media, he began posting photos from the gym, showing off his new commitment to fitness and a confident new appearance. The timing raised eyebrows. His sudden transformation and public enthusiasm for this new chapter of life didn't sit well with those who expected a period of grief. At the same time, Scott began showcasing a sudden passion for luxury, especially high-end cars like Porsches, and an overall lifestyle shift toward extravagance. His displays of wealth and attention-seeking behavior stood in stark contrast to the role of a grieving widower. To many, it felt like a calculated distraction, and it only fueled growing suspicions. The appearance of a new woman in his life didn't go unnoticed either. Scott made no effort to keep the relationship private, attending social events with her in plain view. It gave the impression that he had moved on, quickly and publicly, from the loss of his wife. But the transformation didn't stop with his online presence. Friends and colleagues began noticing changes in his appearance and demeanor. Gone was the reserved, focused physician. In his place stood someone who looked more like a media figure: tailored suits, sleek accessories, designer eyewear, and a polished hairstyle fit for Hollywood. The contrast was striking. To investigators, this behavior didn't line up with that of a man mourning a tragic and unexpected loss. The disconnect between how someone might be expected to grieve and how Scott was actually acting became one more red flag, especially when weighed against the physical evidence already piling up. Instead of retreating or quietly processing his grief, Scott leaned into the spotlight. Luxury, image, and a new romance took center stage. It painted a picture of someone more interested in reinvention than reflection. Someone for whom the death of a spouse might have marked the beginning of a new, carefully curated chapter. By the spring of 2019, the investigation had reached a breaking point. On April 25th, Scott Sills was arrested. The moment came without warning. He was on his way to the clinic to perform a procedure when authorities intercepted him. By the time of his arrest, investigators had compiled a substantial body of evidence. One of the most critical breakthroughs came from forensic analysis. Both Suzanne's and Scott's blood was found at the scene. Some of the samples showed mixed genetic material, an indication of physical contact during the fatal event, and strong evidence that ruled out coincidence. Digital evidence also played a pivotal role. Suzanne's phone and private messages painted a disturbing picture in the weeks leading up to her death. In texts, she described feeling trapped, writing things like, "You're killing me," and "I just want out." Her words revealed a marriage in deep crisis, and a woman in a desperate, emotional state. Investigators also recovered parts of Suzanne's social media and messaging history. In these private conversations, she described how her relationship with Scott had shifted from being a source of support to something that felt more like constant pressure. Her words read like a warning. Signs of an emotional crisis building just beneath the surface. At the time, no one could have imagined that those very messages would later become key pieces of evidence in a homicide investigation. Scott's arrest in April 2019 came after a lengthy and methodical effort to build the case. Authorities emphasized that the decision to take him into custody was made only after the evidence had become overwhelmingly conclusive, when doubt was no longer an option. Following the arrest, the focus shifted entirely to preparing for trial. Prosecutors and investigators now had to organize a massive volume of evidence. It wasn't just about what they'd found. It was about making sure every detail could stand up in court. That meant vetting documents, securing expert opinions, and carefully structuring a case capable of withstanding whatever the defense might bring. From the outset, Scott's legal team made it clear they planned to argue that the prosecution's case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. In response, the prosecution continued to strengthen its position, bringing in new experts, refining forensic arguments, and solidifying the timeline. The pretrial process turned into a legal marathon that would take months to fully unfold. Meanwhile, Scott remained under the weight of the legal system. Hearings were repeatedly delayed due to motions filed by his defense team, each one pushing the timeline further. But the most significant delay came with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020. Courtrooms across the country were shut down and the judicial process slowed to a crawl. Hearings were pushed back for months at a time, and scheduling became a constant moving target. For Suzanne's family, desperate for closure and justice, the prolonged wait became a grueling ordeal. Despite the delays, investigators didn't stop working. By the time pandemic restrictions began to ease, the case against Scott had become a carefully constructed body of evidence, each piece supporting the next, forming a cohesive and deeply detailed narrative. Scott's legal team, on the other hand, used the delay to their advantage. His attorneys challenged the legitimacy of the evidence, worked to exclude documents, and argued that Suzanne's death was nothing more than a tragic accident. The prolonged legal pause created a sense that the defense was hoping public interest would fade, that time itself might dull the impact of the accusations. In 2023, the court finally set a trial date, bringing an end to years of legal preparation. The case, once built behind closed doors by investigators, was now in the hands of a jury, ordinary citizens tasked with deciding Scott's fate. The road from arrest to trial had taken far longer than anyone anticipated back in 2019. But that delay gave both the prosecution and the defense time to sharpen their arguments, setting the stage for what would become one of the most tense and closely watched trials in the county's recent history. The courtroom became the battleground for two entirely different narratives. The prosecution argued that this was a cold, calculated act, a staged killing, carefully masked as an accident. The defense painted a different picture, a terrible, tragic mishap that had been misunderstood from the start. Prosecutors laid out a case of premeditated violence. Medical experts backed this up, pointing to the nature of Suzanne's injuries they claimed simply couldn't have resulted from a simple fall. Adding to the prosecution's case were the results of forensic analysis. One question took center stage. If Suzanne died from a fall near the staircase, why was her blood found in another room? The defense offered no convincing explanation. Scott's attorneys, meanwhile, stuck to their narrative of an accident. They floated an unusual theory that the family's dogs may have played a role. According to them, the animals might have grabbed the scarf accidentally, wrapped it, and worsened her injuries during a fall. It was a theory that many found hard to believe, but the defense pressed on, insisting it accounted for the marks on Suzanne's neck and the scarf's position at the scene. But prosecution experts dismantled that claim. The medical examiner testified that the injuries on Suzanne's neck showed clear signs of manual pressure, not something an animal could inflict. Forensic analysts added that the blood patterns in the daughter's room suggested deliberate human activity, not the random chaos of frightened pets. Then came the testimony from the children, the most emotional and potentially damning moment of the trial. Eric, the couple's son, recalled hearing an argument between his parents, followed by complete silence. He also contradicted his father's earlier statement about them working on a car together the day before, a detail Scott had used to explain the injuries found on his own body. That inconsistency cast serious doubt on his version of events. The trial became a showdown between two versions of reality. One was backed by evidence, expert opinion, and direct witness accounts. The other relied on unlikely scenarios and questionable explanations. And in the end, it was up to the jury to decide, was Scott Sills a grieving husband caught in a tragic accident? Or was he the man responsible for orchestrating his wife's death? The final stage of the trial came down to the jury's deliberation. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and the presentation of detailed evidence, The future of Scott Sills was now in their hands. Both the prosecution and defense delivered their closing arguments. But by then, it was clear the playing field wasn't even. The defense's theory that the tragedy had somehow involved the family dogs didn't hold up well in court. Jurors also weighed the inconsistencies in Scott's own testimony. Each time he tried to explain away the evidence, his story seemed to shift, growing more tangled and less believable. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that came as little surprise: guilty of second-degree murder. As the judge read the decision aloud, the courtroom fell silent. Among those in attendance were Suzanne's friends and family, people who had waited years for this moment. They had finally heard the words they'd long been hoping for. In March 2023, the court handed down the final sentence. Scott Sills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the day of sentencing, as the courtroom held its breath, Scott's daughter, Marie-Catherine, asked to speak. Her words became the emotional climax of the trial, a heartfelt plea for mercy. This was a child who had lost everything, first her mother, and now, with her father's conviction, the only parent she had left. She stood before the judge and described her father not as the man on trial, but as the dad she still loved. Someone who, despite everything, had shown her care and warmth. Her statement was raw, filled with the quiet pain of a daughter who just wanted to preserve some sliver of connection to her family. She begged the court not to impose the harshest sentence. She asked for a future, even a distant one, in which she might one day see her father again, not through prison glass, but as a part of her life. But the court, bound by law and guided by the overwhelming weight of evidence, could not grant her request. The sentence remained unchanged: life without parole. For Marie-Catherine, the ruling was devastating. Her plea had not been enough to alter the course of the court. In that moment, she fully understood the scope of her loss. Her mother was gone, and now her father would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Her words stayed with everyone in that courtroom, a solemn reminder that behind legal definitions and clinical testimonies lie deeply personal, human tragedies. In this case, the most vulnerable wasn't just the victim. It was the child caught between love, grief, and the finality of justice. In his closing remarks, the prosecutor called the crime the final betrayal. He spoke not just of a life taken, but of a trust shattered. Scott Sills, a doctor who once gave others hope, had destroyed his own family from within, delivering a blow that would ripple through every life connected to his. The tragedy was complete. A seemingly perfect family undone. Suzanne was gone. The children were left without parents. Scott was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. And the house that once echoed with laughter had become a haunting reminder of everything lost, a place where the damage was total and the healing out of reach. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.